I want to tell you a story this morning about some frustration I remember as a child, and I think that most of us might have had a similar frustration level. But I remember when I was a kid, growing up, my parents moved to work to Alexandria, where I grew up, and I was like 6 hours away from both sets of grandparents. Did anybody else grow up like far away from grandparents? And like, what's awesome is hopefully sometimes you find other grandparents. Well, mine were Jay and Nan Ford. Jay and Nan Ford were awesome. Mr. J always got me really cool gifts. And I remember we went there to their house. They kind of lived out in the country outside Alexandria. And I remember this was around Christmas. And their Christmas present to me was, I'm 37, born in 1980. So some of you might remember, this was like the hot Christmas present one year. But it was a full laser tag set. You remember that one? Remember how awesome that was? Like, I drove my parents crazy with laser tag. Let me tell you though, and some of you might have been in these shoes. You might have been the offender, and you might have been the offendee in this situation. But we went to Jay and Nan's house on a Sunday during the Christmas season. If you give an 8-year-old a present that requires batteries, what needs to come in the present? I love Jay and Nan Ford. There's only one thing they have ever done in my life that did not cause it to be fulfilled and happy and absolutely enjoyed. Mr. J one time built a swing for me in this huge old oak tree. It had to have a 65-foot rope, and the arc that you could get on, I mean, they're fantastic. But there was not batteries with laser tag. And this is before remote controls were everywhere. You've done that. You have to find the AA or the AAAs, and you start like dissecting every single thing in the house, like to scavenge the batteries. Every battery we still did not have enough battery for laser tag. And I was just, but what I didn't understand was, this is a Sunday, and the gas station was closed. The Family Dollar was closed. It was like a 20-mile drive to find something open with batteries. Now, Mr. J, we got in the truck and we went and found some batteries that day. But I remember like him trying to explain to me why stores were not open on Sunday. Okay, if you've ever lived, and if you've ever lived around a place that does not have a Chick-fil-A, what is the one day you will find a Chick-fil-A? Sunday, right? It's the first time you're within like 180 miles of a Chick-fil-A, it happens to be a Sunday. Like we've had this like Sunday, and I remember as a kid just could not understand this. My grandfather was like, at his house, like you have to sit in the chair and read a book on Sunday. Like the prohibitions of anything. Like, I remember he told me I couldn't go like shoot like the 22 at the Vienna sausage can. He's like, no, it's Sunday, you can't, it's a day of rest. Like we have this like inherent like this latent thing about Sunday, about Sabbath, and we've started a series last week that's called Living at the Edge. Asking questions about what does it mean to have a fulfilled life versus a full life. And too often times we pursue full lives to find out that they leave us empty. And that a fulfilled life is very different, but we do not need to be stretched thin. And this week we're talking about Sabbath. We're talking about rest. We're talking about this concept. But I found some statistics this week about work that I want to share with you. And I did my research because every one of these seems absolutely unbelievable to me. And I found out how true they are. That it explains the anxiety we have attached to our time and to the idea of rest. But this is from the International Labor Organization. This is wild here. So Americans on average work 137 hours more than the Japanese. This statistic is from 2015. That we work 260 hours more a year than the British. That we work 499 more hours a year than the French. That's equivalent of 3 months of work. Now, also, you come down to the next ABC News, and I could not find an updated version of this because it terrifies me what it would be when I update it. But the difference from 1970 to 1990, a 20-year period, that we work a month more a year than we did in 1970. Now that's 27 years old. I would be terrified to know what that's like now. When we say we feel overworked and we feel busy, the statistics are there to prove it. This is interesting. You remember just a few months ago, in the news cycle was the USS McCain crash, that accident in the Pacific. That the studies have already shown that the sailors on the USS McCain, but also just across the Navy and the entire Pacific Fleet, were working 30 hours more than was recommended a week. That, friends, we have a time problem. Like, we have a serious time problem. One of the things we did to prepare for this series is we did a lot of surveying and work, and we fixed it to where it could only come up if you lived in Ouachita Parish. So we surveyed a lot of folks. You know, Foundry, we run about 150 to 175 on a Sunday morning. We got back 67 responses. The years I spent in college, there's a small amount of time I actually paid attention, and that was getting a degree in social research. That's a pretty good sample size. And we found some just astounding statistics, and these are coming from you. This is not coming from anywhere else. This is coming from you. Over 50% of people, when we asked the question, I consistently need more. Over 50% of you said, I need more time for family, and I need more time for recreation. That's over half said that. The next thing's very interesting. Said I'm worried the most about 56.3 of you, the largest section out there, said about having more time with those I love. Like, that's the data of this room right here. Friends, we have a time problem. Like, we have a bad time problem, and it's affecting all of us. And the thing that I want us to think about this morning, though, is how we attempt to fix our time problems. And this morning I want us to think about this, that crashing is not the same as resting. Crashing is not the same as resting. Getting to the end of your rope and firing up Netflix on your iPad actually does not do us any good. I am the first person to claim that I do that. You know, running till we're at our wits' end and then trying to cram 3 days of vacation when we might have worked for 8 weeks straight. And we come home more stressed than we were when we left. Is not resting. Us working on average 499 more hours a year than other countries in the developed world teach us that we are not resting. And resting is a biblical idea and concept. So this morning we're going to talk about Sabbath. We're going to talk about the whole idea, the concept. We're going to talk about the reason I couldn't find batteries in the country when I was 8 years old. We're going to talk about what does the Bible teach us about resting, because the thing is, Sabbath and the idea of rest are synonymous. It's the exact same word. It's the exact same concept. And we see this is one of the oldest things. It's one of the core principles of the Old Testament. It's one of the core principles of Judaism. The idea of Sabbath is what got Jesus consistently in trouble with other people. Like, this is a crucial piece of faith, of following God. So we're going to kind of trot this out across all of Scripture, but we find it in the beginning in Genesis 2:1-3. This is what it says. So the creation of the heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. On the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation, so he rested from all of his work. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because it was the day when he rested from all his work of creation. We see that this idea of rest, that this means cessation, that this means stopping. Now, when we crash, we attempt to stop, right? We attempt to block ourselves off from every single thing that might stress us out. We're seeing that crashing, though, is not the same thing as resting, because cessation's and what we see God doing here is this an intense, intentional pattern of stop. That he stopped because of what he had done before. That this resting that he put himself into is signifying the creation of a new reality. He was transitioning from the way the world was in one place to the way the world would be from here on out. And then he gave the mandate to his people to practice rest. Exodus chapter 20. Verses 8-11. This is what we're familiar with. It's from the Ten Commandments. It's where we're familiar with this. But this is what God and how he explained this out, that his people would take place in this practice of Sabbath. He said, remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigners living among you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. On the seventh day he rested. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. So we see to start to explain and work out inside Exodus. Some of you might remember that the way that the Israelites received provision and received food during the Exodus was they found manna, and they woke up and it was outside and it was on the ground. But on the day before the Sabbath, they were instructed to gather 2 days worth of manna because it would not be there on the next day. And if they gathered too much of it, it would rot, and it was just a specific pattern that we see that Sabbath also has nothing to do with us not going and doing something. It has nothing to do with us staying away from a physical labor, but this is about us and our pattern of consumption. About saying, there's 1 day a week that I do not want you to be obsessed with consuming and being prepared to consume. There's 1 day where I want you just to simply stop and breathe and realize everything has been provided for you. To stop and be able to say, everything's good enough. To stop and be able to say, I feel safe right now. To stop and be able to say, I don't feel the need to produce. I don't feel the need to worry. I don't feel the need to allow myself to obsess about something that Jesus has under control. This idea of Sabbath and rest is much bigger than that. We actually see it carry over. This is the place where I personally just become fascinated with Sabbath as we go into the book of Joshua. Right after they have come into the promised land, and they're in this pattern of taking the land that God has promised to them. This is a very interesting concept. I want you to think about this, but Joshua 11:23. So Joshua took control of the entire land just as the Lord had instructed Moses. He gave it to the people of Israel as their special possession, dividing the land among the tribes. So the land finally had rest from war. In the Hebrew, it says the land had Sabbath. And it stops right there. Think about the physical place having rest. And what you see actually is God, and we're not going to go through all these instances in the Old Testament where you see there's this whole idea of the year of Jubilee, that after a set amount of time that they would not farm and they would not practice, they would not grow crops that year to give the land rest. That during the year of Jubilee, also property reverted back to its original owners. So if something had happened and your family was caught really, really tight and you had to sell a piece of property that had belonged to you for a long, long time, that is an act of restorative justice on that year of Jubilee, that land was then given back to you. In fact, when you sold land during the Jubilee, you only were able to sell it for the price of the amount of crops you could harvest from that point until the next year of Jubilee. So you were, in essence, you could figure out, well, I'm selling this land for 17 years. And that's how the price was set, because it was designed to go back. This idea of rest, that inside of God's people, there are multiple patterns and rhythms of stopping, of season, of refocusing, of simply not feeling worried about taking care of things. In many ways, Sabbath, it talks about a transition into stability, of us marking our time of rest as a season of stability. Think about that. Like the times wherever we're actually able to get a good rest in is when we realize that things are stable enough for me to not have to worry right now. It's like the difference between going vacation when you've done your hustle work and you're able to leave with a clean desk instead of leaving with multiple things piled up and knowing that when you get home it's going to be even worse than it was when you got back. That Sabbath, this idea of resting, is a season of stability. That's what, in fact, when God rests on the seventh day, he had formed this earth, formed this creation out of the chaos and was now reigning over it. The land had rest from war. The land had transitioned into a season of stability with God's people there. And so when we transition into rest, when we make these statements we find in the Old Testament, it's almost as though God is saying, or the land is saying, or the people are saying, all right, from here on out, now we can be fulfilled. The stage is set for peaceful action and activity. I'm going to be honest with you. I've not felt that much lately that things are set for peace and stability. Always worried about the next thing. Actually, always worried about the next 15 things, of which I will probably forget half of them. When we rest, we find stability. When we crash, we're simply just avoiding something that actually terrifies us. Resting isn't the same as crashing. The last passage I want us to think about is one that is just full of assumptions that we can make about rest. It's in the New Testament. It's in the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, verse 11. It's something that's remarkably different than what we have read in the past before. Hebrews is also the hardest book for me to find in the Bible 9 times out of 10. I will bet lunch on that. So we're just going to read it behind you. See, I didn't rest well enough to actually market my Bible this week, full disclosure. I always say I'm honest with y'all, right? Okay, this is what it says. God's promise of entering his rest still stands. So we ought to tremble with fear that some of you might fail to experience it. For this good news that God has prepared this rest has been announced to us just as it was to them. But it did them no good because they didn't share the faith of those who had listened to God. For only we who believe can enter his rest. As for the others, God said, in my anger I took an oath, they will never enter my place of rest. Even though this rest has been ready since he made the world, we know it is ready because of the place in the scriptures where it mentions the seventh day. On the seventh day, God rested from all his work. But in the other passage, God said, they will never enter my place of rest. So God's rest is there for people to enter, but those who first heard this good news failed to enter because they disobeyed God. So God set another time for entering his rest, and that time is today. God announced this through David much later in the words already quoted. Today, when you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. Now, if Joshua had succeeded in giving them this rest, God would not have spoken about another day of rest is still to come. So there is a special rest still waiting for the people of God. For all who have entered into God's rest have rested from their labors, just as God did after creating the world. So let us do our best to enter that rest. But if we disobey God as the people of Israel did, we will fail. First of all, how many times was the word rest in there? But think about this. This is what the writer of Hebrews is telling us, is that this is actually all about rest. In many of our minds, hopefully it didn't take too long for you to realize, this writer's talking about heaven. This writer's talking about eternity. He's talking about God's plan for us. He speaks about rest. Now think about this. This is what has boggled my mind all week long as I've been praying and reflecting through this. We understand that sin has entered this world and that brokenness affects us all. The news cycle this week has been all about brokenness. It's been all about evil. That we live in a broken world. But in spite of how broken this is, God's final action of creation was to rest. And the thing that he made sure was extremely important to his people was to communicate rest to them. Rest might be the best way for us to experience God right now in our life. And it's still offered to us. It's given to us as something that's possible. It's given to us as a way that we can interact with him. It's part of our natural life cycle. It's the thing that keeps us healthy. It's the thing that keeps us whole. If we realize how important it is to us, why on earth are we not resting better? when it might be one of the biggest ways for us to experience Jesus. Resting is not the same as crashing. See, resting makes us really start thinking about how we view time, the way that we see time in our life, the way that we see time controlling us in our life. Rest is about revitalization. When was the last time you felt revived? When you were truly whole and ready and excited. You see, crashing is not being revived. If anything, crashing is this temporary retreat from a battle that you were terrified of. It's you saying, these are all the things in life that are stressing me out, so I'm just gonna put on blinders for a moment so I can't see them. That's what crashing is. Crashing is the lie of playing catch up. But for those of you who have to live in a life cycle sometimes where you're playing tons of catch up, is catch up ever actually reviving to you? Is playing catch up ever actually fulfilling? No, it's not. Resting is the space for us to be us. And any larger anxiety we have about time, it should make us think about the way that we handle what matters to us, what we are the most passionate about, the things that might worry us the most. How can we live a life where we know, to where we manifest, and to where we live into the restful presence of God? And if that we're not resting, we might be prohibiting the work of revitalization in our own heart and soul that God wants to give us the most. Crashing is not the same as resting. So thinking about it, Jesus and the Pharisees, they love to come at him over this idea of resting. And in Mark, Jesus ultimately has to tell the Pharisees, he says, you were not created for something like this. The Sabbath was not created for you. You're created for the Sabbath. This tension that we get turned around and we get frustrated about this idea of rest. Who here actually maybe feels bad when they're resting? Who stresses out about actually stopping for a moment? We don't want to tell people, I'm actually taking a couple days off right now. Like we're terrified to tell somebody that sometimes. Has anybody ever been scared to let folks know that you're actually not doing something? We need to reframe ourselves. We're thinking that we don't understand true life if we cannot practice stopping. It's that plain and simple. Our time issue is a spiritual issue, and that we need to deeply learn about rest. So a couple of things. This is where I was this week in my own personal reflection on this, because like I told y'all, these few weeks, I did not anticipate a couple of months ago how much this series would be prophetic into my own life. So this is my own thoughts that I want to offer to you as I contemplated this idea of rest myself. Because this was the first week, I told multiple people, in 7 weeks where I was home the entire week. This was the first week where I had the possibility of not being stretched to the end of my margin. So this is what I thought about this week. The first thing is this. What do I need to stop doing? When was the last time you asked yourself the question, what do I need to stop doing in life? It's about us wrestling the temptation of a full life. There's a guy named Bob Goff. Some of you might have heard of him before. I like him a lot. Bob Goff says he stops doing something every day. Can you imagine stopping doing something every day? He's very successful. Here's the problem with you stop doing something every day. Sooner or later, you have to stop doing things that are really important. And he said he does this practice just to teach him that nothing has the ability to control him except for Jesus. I remember earlier this year, I stopped doing something that I liked a lot, and I was blown away with how much better it made my life. I stopped a project that had been fruitful. It had been very good for me. It had been a practice that was life-giving, but it got to the point in time where it was taking up way too much time during my week at a crucial point in time during my week, and I stopped doing it. And I'm glad I did now. And it was tough. Meredith, for about 6 or 8 months, kept telling me, why don't you quit doing this? Why don't you quit doing this? And it was a good thing. Oftentimes we think about stopping doing only the things that are in theory bad for us. But how can your world be possibly affected positively by stopping something? From a negative perspective, what are the practices of crashing that you need to stop? I'll tell you one that I'm working on right now. I made the decision last night. I've just got to fix this. I've never slept well in my entire life. I just don't sleep good. And I read something about a year ago from someone who said, if you have problems sleeping, you need to find something absolutely mindless to do before you go to bed. And he recommended this extremely boring show on the BBC about a guy starting a hobby farm. And there's no story arc. You know how most television shows are at weird tension point about halfway through and there's the resolution of it? No, this is literally, and the show's 20 years old. It's just some British guy in this tiny little house that's 500 years old that always looks about to collapse on top of himself. And it's about him growing cucumbers and feeding a sheep and making a rhubarb pie. And I was like, okay, you know what? That actually makes a little sense. So I'm going to start doing that. So for the first time ever, and I'd always heard the whole, you don't do screens before you go to bed. And I had fought adamantly to not have a TV in the bedroom, the whole 9 yards. So about 9 months ago, I started watching an episode of this show on YouTube on my iPad, literally in bed right before I go to sleep. And you know what it did? It did calm my mind at first. The guy was right. It's absolutely mindless. It's the perfect thing. But then it got me to the point where I would just sit there and watch YouTube in bed for an hour every night. It made me spend way too much money on tools because I like woodworking videos. It made me get hungry because I start watching pizza videos. If you want to watch a lot of videos on YouTube, just search pizza. Trust me, it's not a good thing to do. And now I can't sleep unless I watch YouTube for 45 minutes. Y'all, that's crashing. That's not resting. That time can be better. So next Sunday, I want you to ask me, Chad, how many nights did you watch YouTube before you went to bed? Because that's a practice of crashing. And I made the decision this morning. I was I've just got to knock this out. What can you say no to for the sake of saying yes to something else? The second question, what do I need to start doing? What do we need to start doing? What would signify something new in your life? Remember, Sabbath is about marking seasons, that this is a life of rhythm that God has given us. What do you need to start new in your life? I'll tell you something accidentally that started a few weeks ago in my life that I love now. Meredith's car was in the shop a few weeks back. And I saw that Byron from Roller Roaster had this really crazy Vietnamese noodle bowl thing for lunch that day. And so I said, hey, listen, you don't have your car. I'm sure you're tired of the cafeteria. Let's go get lunch this week. So Meredith and I in the last few weeks have started getting lunch together every Tuesday. That's blocked out for me now. It's you know what? That's time I used to use for something else. That's time that in theory I could be using for moving the ball forward a little bit more. But I'm realizing that's more valuable in my life to have. And it's always quick. I pick her up. It's always funny because the mirrors, my truck always hit the call box at CenturyLink and I have to get out and hit the button. If you want to watch me try to get into CenturyLink, it's funny. But I value that. It's something I knew started my life that makes my life better. What could you do? New. What's actually restful in your life? And you can put in, I changed the alternator in my truck yesterday. It took 10 minutes. It was restful because I finished something. For a lot of us, we have jobs that we actually never get to finish things in life. I got to finish something. For 15 minutes, changing an alternator was extremely restful. What can you add into your life, into your relationship with your family, to the relationship with your friends, to your relationship with work? What can you add in to be truly restful, to mark a new season, to mark a new time? The last thing is this. What is absolutely worth my time? There's tons of variations of this quote. I couldn't really trace it back to who's the first person to say this. But what do you have the time? What do you not have the time to not do? Think about what is something that's so important to you that you absolutely do not have the time to not do that. As Christians, I will always say this over and over and over. For every single thing that my life has diverted and moved and shaped and shifted and become interesting and awkward, I'm thankful that I grew up in a family and a church that just impressed upon me the importance of just daily spending time with God. And it sounds rote, and it sounds old-fashioned, and it sounds somewhat eye-rolling, but what I found out is that I do not have the time to not do that. Now, some of you are saying, well, Chad, you're a preacher. Of course you have to do that. Hey, y'all, I could tell you what ministry is like sometimes not doing that, because I've done that before. And I can wing this without doing that. But I can't wing this without doing that. There's a difference. I can tell and other people can tell honestly too. Like for me, that's just, I don't have the time to not do that. Now, because of my job, it takes me a little bit more time to do that sometimes. I don't have the time to not be at home a few nights a week. How many of you are tired of being gone every single night a week? I don't have the time to not finish something every week now, I've learned. Lessons learned, swapping out a cheap alternator you bought off Amazon. What do you have the time to not do? What's absolutely worth your time? 56.3% of you said that you're consistently worried about having time with those you love. What do you absolutely not have the time to not do to pour into those relationships? Crashing is not the same as resting. Y'all, we were created for a fulfilled life. And in Scripture, we see that fulfilled life is explained out as rhythms of rest and rhythms of work. Not because we are supposed to be producing and consuming, because we are made to function in the mirror image of God. That we are people who are created for stability. We are people who are created for satisfaction. We are people who are created for completion. We are people who are created to be the image of the God who made this world. Friends, we are created to rest. As the Hebrews passage showed us, rest is what our eventual eternal outcome will be. And I really hope, I do not think that heaven is going to look like power watching How I Met Your Mother on Netflix. That's crashing. Eternity will be something that's fulfilling, that's completing, that's peaceful. And we're given the ability to practice that right now.